Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 8. And as you saw in the announcement on the Blackboard site, I swapped weeks 8 and 9. So this is the material I was going to cover next week, but it seemed to be more logical to do it this week. So let me move right into that. Okay, so this is what we're covering this week. The title of this slide is the Positivist Toolbox, and that's because that's named after the chapter in chapter 3 of the Clemens and Macbeth text, which you didn't buy, of course, but I've provided you a PDF copy of this chapter 3. And chapter 3 talks about some tools of what they call positivist um, or quantitative policy analysis. So you might pick up a little bit of the tone of the chapter that Clemens and Macbeth aren't necessarily quantitative in their approach, but that's okay because I think this chapter actually does a really good job of talking about some of the more important things. So that's your reading, chapter 3. Um, and it's a real practical chapter because that's what I'm going to talk about in the lecture and in a demo I'm going to do. The second reading, really, if you will, is on the chapter or the week 8 site on Blackboard. There are several videos from an organization called Conservation Strategy Funds. There's about 13 or 14 videos that they have. Now, if you watch them all, it's going to take you about an hour and a half to 2 hours to watch them all. They're actually really great videos, and they are really good references for you to use when you do cost benefit analysis. And that's the reason I want you to look at them. There's another set of optional videos you might want to look at. They're called the MBA BS videos. Um, and I use part of that set. And the person who does that really is looking at cost benefit analysis more from a private sector perspective. Um, but so those are all the things that I want you to look at for this week. The craft chapter 6 chapter, you can skim it a little bit, but we're going to talk about that more next week. Okay, so first of all, as I've said from the beginning, this course is not a research methods course. And second, uh, for the scope of the policy analysis of this course, you probably don't have time to do really deep quantitative policy analysis anyway, and you probably don't have time to do some of the things that are talked about in chapter 3. So for this week, we're going to talk about what's in chapter 3, but I'm going to really focus on one thing, and that is cost benefit analysis. So those 5 things at the bottom are the things I want to talk about really quickly in this lecture. Okay, so first of all, surveys. And I think in your research methods class, you probably talked about surveys. So I really just want to focus on a couple of things from a practical standpoint. Um, you remember from research methods discussing sample size and that you have to have a sample size of sufficient quantity to make generalizations and to do statistics on it. Um, Typically, a confidence interval of 95% with a margin of error of plus or minus 5% is acceptable in social sciences, and it's certainly acceptable for the kind of work you would be doing as a policy analyst. Um, if you use surveys, then that means that you have to send out a lot more because then you really need because you should plan on a large percentage of people never responding to your survey. Um, your surveys should be random and they shouldn't overrepresent or underrepresent particular groups. And that's kind of up to you what you name as a group. I mean, you could be talking about gender, ethnicity, age, religion, urban versus rural, other characteristics. And so you have to be really careful about sample bias. So surveys, and this question, the reason I put this in here is because um, say you're working in city government, the first question you really ought to ask yourself is really, do I really want to put a survey out to the citizens of the city to ask them a question? Are there other ways I could find out what the preferences of the citizens of the city are, for example? Um, there might be other methods that might be just as effective, but when you do surveys, the biggest thing in surveys really isn't the statistics. The biggest thing is having validity in the instrument itself. And so that's called construct validity. If you create a survey that is biased at its base, then whatever kind of statistics you do with your survey respondents, they're going to be biased in the output. So it's important that whenever you're doing a survey, you understand that, you know, what you put together with the survey is really going to drive the validity of it. So, when you put together a survey, and this actually goes for interviews too, write clear questions and statements. Avoid awkward wording, negatives, multiple information in one question, and things like that. So, if you look at, there's some really good examples in the Clemens and Macbeth book. For example, on page 66, here's an example of a really bad question. Do you agree or disagree that the United States should not intervene in the affairs of other countries unless national interests are directly at stake? So what's wrong with that question? Well, it's that negative in there. Do you agree that the United States should not intervene? I mean, do you agree that something should not be done? That's really an awkward way to ask that question. Um, do you agree or disagree that local taxes are too high and that the city summer recreation program should be discontinued? Well, that actually has two things wrong with it. One is it's double barreled. It's asking about the level of local taxes. And the second thing it's asking about is a summer recreation program. So that surveyor is asking two questions in one statement. And then the other thing they're doing is they're biasing the question by saying, do you agree or disagree that local taxes are too high? Well, so what the survey is already doing is saying they're too high. Do you agree or disagree with me? And then a third question on that same page, what is your income? Well, what does that mean? Is that weekly, monthly, yearly? Is it gross? Is it net? Um, when you're doing a survey, one of the best strategies you can use is use what they call a Likert scale. I'm sure you're familiar with that. That's the typical kind of survey question you see that expresses agreement or disagreement on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 or even 1 to 10 I've seen on surveys. And so really what that allows you to do is to be able to create coded data out of those responses, and you're asking questions that go beyond agree or disagree. Um, so again, you want to avoid bias questions, as I've said. For example, on page 67, an example that the authors give, do you agree or disagree that the disastrous policies of President Blank helped create our current foreign policy problems? So yes, so that president had disastrous policies. Well, again, the surveyor is biasing um, the responses already. And then at the one at the bottom of page 67, which I think is really entertaining, uh, asking citizens to answer the question about transuranic waste transportation. Well, what does that term mean? If you're going to ask questions on a survey, don't use a lot of jargon and technical jargon that your audience isn't going to understand. I mean, if you're asking a question about nuclear power and you're asking a bunch of, your whole audience on the survey is nuclear physicists, then you have a way you can construct the survey. But if it's ordinary citizens, um, then you have to use language that they will understand. Um, the last thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you have your statistics in mind when you put a survey together. I mean, what kind of data are you looking for? Nominal data, continuous data, interval variables? Um, do you have your coding in mind? So, for example, when you ask uh, an audience to choose between 8 alternatives, perhaps instead of just asking them to choose, you could actually rank them so that you can code those in a rank order. So the next several slides briefly discuss some other concepts in the reading. And by the way, that section on surveys, go back and read it. I don't expect that for this project you would have time to do a full-blown survey research. You may have time to do some interviews, and interviews are good to do for this policy analysis project, but you won't have time to do a lot of interviews. I mean, you're not going to have time to do 15 interviews, but if you do some interviews and you mentioned that you did interviews, that's good. But I really don't expect that you would have time to do a full rigorous survey. So I don't see the point in really covering it in a lot of depth. But keep in mind, obviously, it's a tool that we use all the time. The next several slides are going to go along with a demo, an Excel demo that I'm going to provide, which I also want you to watch. So this part will be a little bit on the sparse side too, but I want to cover the essentials. Okay, in one of the demos, I'm going to talk about extrapolation, and the authors start talking about that on page 71 and 72. And the example they give is extrapolating population. So if you had a project where, you want to provide a service to the citizens of your city, for example, and you want to try to figure out what you think the population is going to be in 10 years, there's ways you can do that. And that's the example that they give. I'm going to talk about that in quickly in the demo. But just some things to keep in mind on that. Whenever you're trying to project something like population or taxes that you're going to get in revenue, um, you got to be really careful because the future does not always resemble the past. And things happen, and things have happened in the past that you might not know about. For example, a city might have grown due to annexation. They might have annexed a community of 10,000 people. That's not natural growth in a city. That's an annexation. So you have to be aware of the environment and what's going on. Again, I'm going to talk about this just really quick in the demo. Um, the other thing I'm going to talk about in the demo, and I'm setting all this up now so you understand where I'm coming from, is I want to talk just real briefly about historical trends in growth, and specifically the example I use is growth in expenditures for a particular federal government program that I'm going to show you. Um, that's why is that useful? That's useful sometimes because it, you want to know what's occurred in the past if you can in a particular program or budget area. If your parks department, if your parks director comes in with a budget number for next year, it would be good to know what historically the parks department has, what their level of expenditure has been, and those that kind of documentation is available. And it's also good to be able to understand, okay, what has the typical growth of the parks department been over the past 10 years or 20 years or 50 years? And so I go through an example of that in the demo as well. The next thing that covered in chapter 3 is measures of central tendency. And I just want to go over a couple things here. Um, And then again, I'm going to talk about this real briefly in the demo. So really, there's really the book mentions three kinds of data that varies. Well, you could say it's four as well. There's really four. There are nominal, ordinal, and interval data. Well, interval data and ratio data are related. They're both kind of called continuous data sometimes. So when you hear the word continuous data, it's talking about interval variables or ratio variables. But nominal data is simply binary, 1, 0. If you had a code sheet and you were coding your responses on a survey, that would be some of your demographic data, perhaps, male or female. Are you are you a college student or not? So typically, things like that. Did you vote in the 2016 election? Yes or no? That's nominal data, where your choices are typically uh, named things. Um, and there's no in between for them typically. Um, ordinal data are things that you can represent with ranking. And here again, this is where Likert scales and surveys come in really handy. If you have a list of agree, disagree statements on a particular policy. Say you have 10 questions on this policy that you want to ask your target audience. It's better, instead of asking them, do you agree with this policy or disagree with this policy, to give them a scale of agreement or disagreement, say 1 to 5. Um, the reason being is that allows you to do more statistical work with those ordinal uh, data. The other kind of ordinal data, again, is one where you are asking people, for example, to list preferences. So, would you rather, you know, uh, what are the kind of things that you would like to do for recreation? And you might give a whole list of things, go go have a picnic, go canoeing or kayaking, go bowling, you know. Um, And so you ask the people to list them from 1 to 10. And there again, that enables you to do more statistical work with those responses. So interval data and ratio data are continuous data. That means there's a 0 point. There might be negative points too, but there's a 0 point, and it allows the person to use numbers to give you responses. So how many times did you order books from Amazon last year? And you would have the person put in there 1 time, 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times. How many years have you lived in Omaha? Um, you know, all my life, which would be however old you are, 35 years. Um, or 1 year. Um, and then like interval data, ratio data is simply expressed as a ratio of the whole. And sometimes that's handy when you have that continuous data, but you know that it's going to fall into certain groups, like the lower 25%, the middle 20 or the second 25%, third 25%, fourth 25%. It's sometimes good to group things that way in those ratios, um, so that for ease of presentation for one thing, but often um, it just shows it's allowing you to categorize responses into fewer groups. So those are the kinds of data. Um, and again, what you do with that data, um, you have to do it in a viable way and employ those lessons that you learned in um, research methods. But um, you as a policy analyst, and especially if you're working in the public sector, the most important thing about data is that you're not incorrectly using it, that you're not misrepresenting the data that you have. That is the most important thing about data. Don't misrepresent it. Don't say that you have a random sample when you don't. Don't say that the survey demonstrates that everybody in the city wants wants us to build a new community center when your whole survey went out to 10 people. So that is the most important thing about the use of data, especially in the public sector, is use it honestly, um, and use it in the way it was intended. I I I wanted to mention that last one, which is understand the difference and the effects of using mean, median, and mode of observed data, and I'm going to talk about that in the demo. Okay, so this is the main thing I want to talk about for this week, and I'm going to spend a lot more time in the demo on this. So cost benefit analysis or benefit cost analysis, you're going to hear both terms used, right? Um, well, what's the difference? I mean, it's actually it's a ratio. Speaking of ratio data, cost benefit analysis means the ratio of cost to benefits. How much did this cost in percentage to benefits, or what is the benefit in the ratio of cost? So what's the percentage of benefit to cost? It's just two different ways of expressing almost the same thing, but it is a ratio. Um, so this explanation that I go through here considers the example in the text, the swimming pool example. So I'd like you also to look at the Conservation Strategy Funds video series. They use different examples, of course, but they provide some really excellent instruction. Okay, so in the private sector, a cost benefit analysis really considers mostly internal costs and benefits, right? So it's basically fiscally based. But in the public sector, we often try to calculate other costs and benefits that affect either the overall economy or the local economy. Therefore, we call it usually an economic cost benefit analysis because, for example, you're going to be trying to monetize things that aren't just having to do with the city's budget, for example, but the benefit or the cost to the local population. So the foundation of any cost benefit analysis is the notion that all costs and benefits can somehow be monetized. But that's a lot easier said than done because so in practice, how does one monetize or put dollar values on things like air pollution, which is an externality? The factory produces some good, but in the process of doing that, it puts some hazardous chemicals into the air. The wind picks up that that plume. That plume blows to the east, say, um, and then causes acid rain in another city. Well, how do you monetize that? And that's actually something that a classic thing that people have struggled with for a long time. How do we monetize costs and benefits outside our control? So here I want to talk about, we're doing an economic cost benefit analysis. How do we monetize the effect on local businesses of building a new baseball stadium? So we're trying to justify a new baseball stadium. Um, and so we're going to try to talk about how this is going to improve businesses in that neighborhood, or even some new businesses will move into the neighborhood and they're going to make X amount of dollars. But how can we do that when we don't even know what businesses they are yet? Do we, is it going to be X amount of taverns, X amount of restaurants, a clothing store, a bike store? What's it going to be? But we have to do that. Um, and then how do we monetize other social costs? For example, the cost of juvenile delinquency that will be diminished if we build a new community center with a pool and basketball court. So we say that when we build the community center, it's going to be partially paid for because it will reduce juvenile crime in the city. Well, that's good, but how do we monetize that? So that's kind of the difficulty of doing a cost benefit analysis, because it relies on your ability to actually come up with dollar figures for most of your costs and benefits. In the book, in the Clemens and Macbeth book, they list 9 cost benefit steps. So just kind of stare at those for a second and look down that list. This looks pretty familiar, right? This looks a lot like the steps that we're using for our policy analysis project. Well, a cost benefit analysis is a way of doing policy analysis. Um, so these steps really look familiar, right? And um, what we're trying to do is create a way of weighting and weighing alternatives, um, but we're doing it with cost. So these steps should seem very familiar to you, and let's kind of go through those and break these down one at a time. Okay, so these first 2 steps are specification of the objectives and identification of alternatives. This is really important. Um, Go to that third bullet under specification of objectives. What is your vision of success? Well, if you've taken strategic planning, that's a question that's asked about organizations. Well, this is a lot like strategic planning. Um, what, you can't just come in and say, our project is to build a community center. Well, but what do you hope to accomplish with that community center? I mean, what is it you're really trying to do with the community center? Are you trying to, for example, are you saying that you're going to reduce delinquency because you're giving the youth of the city some place to go that doesn't involve, shoplifting or vandalism? Um, and you have to think through what is it you're really trying to accomplish? How long is it going to take? What's the time horizon that your project's going to cover? Is this something that the private sector is already doing? And if that's the case, then why are we trying to compete with the private sector? And the last thing I asked there is, who's helping you to do this? I ask that a lot. Um, one of the themes in public administration is citizen engagement. And sometimes when we do these kinds of projects, this is really a very good opportunity for citizen engagement. Now you have to think about how would I do that? How would I engage with citizens? Perhaps you have a board of citizens helping you. Perhaps you have key stakeholders in the city involved in the process. But you have to think through that too. Who's helping me come up with these objectives? And then the next step is identification of alternatives. Um, for example, how many different ways can you meet the objective? So for the swimming pool example, can we build a splash pad, or do we need a competition-sized swimming pool? I mean, they're both viable, but you have to think about the objectives you're really trying to achieve and how your alternatives fit into your uh, objectives. Is doing nothing a viable alternative? It might be. Is partnering with, say, the private sector or the nonprofit sector or both uh, uh, a viable alternative? And finally, again, who's helping you to do this? How are we um, how are we involving the community, for example, in this effort? Okay, now in this step, we're collecting and analyzing and interpreting information. So this is a lot like policy analysis, the way we have our project set up as well, right? This is the collection of evidence, if you will. So in this step, though, we're kind of looking at how we would generally um, look at cost and benefits. This is where we want to start gathering up what the costs and benefits really are. We're not at the point of specifically monetizing them, but here we want to list them. So for example, what is the expanded list of costs and benefits, and how would you monetize them? Um, what's Can we separate, for example, public costs and benefits from private costs and benefits? So again, remember, if we're looking at some kind of economic cost benefit analysis, we want to include costs and benefits to the local community, but some of that's to private businesses, some of it's to citizens. How do we separate those? Um, into budget costs and economic costs, for example. And then how do you develop a reliable rationale for the costs and benefits you list? You come up with a list of 40 different cost categories and 30 different benefit categories. But you have to have a rationale for why you included those things. And then finally, this question I keep asking, who's helping you with this? Um, if you're building a new ball field downtown, north downtown Omaha, say, um, and you say that it's going to greatly expand business opportunity, well, don't you think you'd get some help from businesses or the Chamber of Commerce? So it's important, again, this is a great opportunity for citizen engagement. Now, let's break it down further. So how do we uh, do these next two steps? Specification of target groups and stakeholders. Well, really, I alluded to that in the last slide, but who are the stakeholders involved in this project? And again, how are you going to involve them? I mean, is it citizens? And then who are the users of the service? Who's really going to use your community center? How are the taxpayers involved and what's their stake in this? Local businesses, peers in other government departments. So our community center example, how do the police feel about it? Do they think it's going to really reduce delinquency? And do they have some specific guidance for you? How about nonprofits, elected leaders? Um, so in this step, you're really looking at your target groups and your stakeholders and building those networks. And then now we get to the point of identifying specific costs and benefits. And here, after you've already generally listed them, is where you really do a lot of accounting work, really. You're going to figure out direct versus indirect costs. I mean, those are those costs like administrative costs because you involve the police department. Um, but direct costs, you're going to hire somebody to work in your youth center. Um, Direct versus indirect benefits for the budget, for the community. Tangible versus intangible costs. So this idea on we're reducing delinquency, but are we also doing things like building up leadership in the youth of the city because we have this community center? How do you monetize that? There are some costs and benefits you might not be able to monetize, and you have to really explain them as tangible or intangible, or actually intangible costs and benefits. And then the private sector costs and benefits. How do you monetize those? And are you doing it in an honest and really transparent way? And then the costs and benefits to peer departments in government, for example, the police, the fire, etc. How do you do all those things? Um, so now we're getting into some of the stuff I want to talk about in the demo, and that is discounting of costs and benefits. Well, okay, so everyone gets a headache when you start talking about doing discounting because nobody knows what it is, and it's something that's hard for them to think through. Well, um, the reason we discount in general is because a given amount of money today, a dollar, for example, today, in general, is worth less 1 year from now. So Put another way, if we invest $1 today, it's going to be worth more in 1 year. Um, but if we as a government or as a nonprofit are going to spend $1 today with the hope that in 5 years or 10 years that's going to provide some benefit, we have to try to understand whether the present value of that dollar is worth more today because of the investment or worth less today because of the investment. And so that's why we discount. It's largely sort of a hypothetical construct. There is no um, perfect discount rate that you should use. Um, some people use something called the risk-free rate. I point to that in the last bullet there, which actually, in that way of thinking, is equal to the 3-month Treasury bill rate, which right now is less than 1%. It's about 0.5% for a 3-month Treasury bill. Treasury bonds from 2 to 30 years are worth between just over 1% and 3% in interest right now. But there's other ways that people invest their money. They invest in real estate where you might earn more, but you might lose more. You invest in the stock market where you will earn more, but you could probably lose more money. Um, so the point is that if we're using the government's money, we have to be thinking through um, at what rate do we think that money could be used alternatively. And so there is no hard and fast rule. Um, but just keep in mind that if we set discount rates too high, we're undervaluing the present value of that dollar. If we set discount rates too low, we're overvaluing the present value of money. And we will talk about that a little bit in the demo. So the last two steps before are selecting your alternative are estimation of risk and uncertainty and the specifications for the selection. So what are your selection criteria? And the last step obviously is making your selection, but you're going to do that based on your specification criteria. So risk and uncertainty. I mean, the big thing is, have you developed a list of consequences for each alternative, and how do these alternatives, including monetary consequences, social consequences, community consequences, how do these things play out? Then what are the risks of each alternative? I mean, what happens if this project falls flat on its face? Who's left holding the bag? Google the Astrodome sometime, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Um, what are the areas of uncertainty, including environmental issues beyond your control? And I don't mean the natural environment, I just mean the environment of business, the social environment. What are you uncertain about? Um, is this a good place to do a SWOT exercise? Have you ever done one of those in strategic planning, a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats exercise? Again, a lot of constructing a cost benefit analysis is like strategic planning. And so I'd ask that question again, who's helping you with this? Um, what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats in your community? And then how's that impact your building your community center, for example? And then what are the specifications for selection of your alternatives? So net present value is going to be one of them. The benefit cost ratio, which we'll go over, is going to be another. But also more intangible ones are actually specifications for selection too, right? Popular support might be one. Political support of your mayor or your council, for example. There are many others. Some are tangible, some not so tangible, but they are all valid selection criteria that you have to apply to each of your alternatives. So this leads us all to this exercise for week one, which I'm going to have you do on the discussion board. But again, like last week, I'm going to encourage you to comment to each other, but you are not required to. It's not part of the grade. So this exercise is going to be in two parts. The first part is going to include a Excel spreadsheet that I want you to develop, and the second part is going to be a write-up. So for the first part, I'm going to have you do an Excel spreadsheet, and this is going to test your skills in discounting and developing net present value of costs and benefits. So you're going to weigh two alternatives for the homeless problem in your city, which is Midtown, USA. So alternative one, you're going to build a 75-bed shelter. And just keep in mind that not all the beds are used each night, but 75 should cover the max for most nights. Um, so the initial cost to build this shelter, it's a really nice shelter. It's going to cost you $10 million. Um, Annual maintenance costs beginning at year one, so you're going to blow through year zero. Beginning at year one is going to be $50,000 a year, and it's a fairly new building, so you don't think it's really going to cost you much more than that to maintain it. Annual payroll costs beginning at year one are going to be $200,000 a year. And then you're going to, because you give your people pay raises, those are going to increase at 3% each year. So year one's going to be $200,000, year two, $206,000, year three, $212,000, $180, and so forth. You're going to increase by 3% each year. So benefits, you're going to save $100,000 each year in police costs, because right now what happens in your city is police have to currently process and book particular homeless people because there's lack of space in the shelter, and they pick up, they follow a protocol in which they try to focus on those who are extremely intoxicated or hostile. Sometimes those people end up in jail. They typically end up in jail, um, and not the shelter. Another benefit is you're going to save $100,000 a year on vouchers that you use for local inexpensive hotels to shelter some homeless persons on a night by night basis. That's about the average of what you're spending. And then another benefit that comes off the 10 million really, but it's a benefit, is the Veterans Administration is giving you a grant for $2 million to help build your shelter because a significant percentage of homeless persons are veterans. So there's a second alternative, and that is keep your current 50-bed shelter open. Okay, so what are the costs of that? Well, the annual maintenance costs beginning at year one are $100,000. It's an older building, so it's costing you a lot more to maintain. Plumbing, electrical, heating, it's just costing you more money. The annual payroll cost, you actually have a smaller staff at your 50-bed shelter, is $175,000 in year one. And again, you're going to increase that at 3% each year. Um, your annual cost of vouchers to local hotels, which we talked about, is $100,000. The annual cost to the police department, again, $100,000. And the benefits in this is that you're saving $10 million because you're not building the new shelter. But $2 million of that came from the Veterans Administration, so really you're just foregoing that grant. So that benefit actually ends up being $8 million. So what you're going to do uh, on this, part one, is you're going to do a spreadsheet, just like the spreadsheets that we're going to talk about in the demo, and you're going to do it for 10 years. And then for part two, what I want you to do is kind of expand beyond that. I covered some basic costs and benefits. Now, what I'd like you to do for part two is kind of circle back and say, okay, let me start from scratch and say, if I had two alternatives, build a new shelter or try to maintain the old shelter, how would I weigh those alternatives? And in this step, what I'd like you to do is spend some time listing costs and benefits for each one of the two options. What you don't have to do in this step is actually monetize the costs and benefits. So what I'd like you to do is provide a list of costs and benefits in a bullet, point by point. And then with each cost and each benefit, I'd like you to include a short rationale of why you came up with that as a cost or benefit, and who's bearing that cost or benefit. Is this a cost or benefit to the city's budget? Is it a cost or benefit to um, the the citizens of the city? Is it a cost or benefit to the nonprofit sector? So, is it a cost or benefit to business? So, include that kind of rationale in there. So again, this exercise, like last week, I'd like you to post it by Friday night at 11:59 p.m. And you don't have to respond to classmates, but if you want to, you're certainly more than welcome to. So again, two-part exercise, a spreadsheet, and some rationale. And then at this point, I'd like you to go ahead and watch uh, the demo for this week. That's all I have for this week. Thanks a lot.